common thread in my career has been telling stories. And I mean, one of the biggest questions that I get asked is, how did you, as a computer science and math major, end up as a Broadway producer? And one of the things that I'd like to say is that I've always been telling stories, and that's a thread that has sort of tied my career together. I joined the log analysis team immediately upon starting at Google, and one of the things that I had to do was to tell people what people were using the website for, and sort of extract the data from the logs, but in order to really understand what was going on, it was about constructing a story. So early on, the advertising group decided that they wanted to get geographic data so that we could target ads better at Google. And it turns out that that was a great way to make a lot of money. When I started at Google, Google was not an advertising company. And within a couple of years, it basically was an advertising company. All of the revenue came from advertising. I don't believe that that's true quite so much anymore, but it still is the big revenue driver for Google. The data set that we originally got that mapped IP addresses to geographic locations only had data for the United States. And this is a plot that one of my coworkers, Matt Cutts, created, showing 1 day's worth of traffic from Google that we had the Geo Data for. And you can pretty much tell that that's the United States. And it's pretty much, you see the population centers in the Northeast and in California. You see that west of the Mississippi, things are pretty light except in Colorado and Salt Lake City. So you actually get a map of where people live in the United States based on this kind of data, which I think is kind of fascinating. But we also had a lot of other kinds of stories that we could tell based on this data. Oh, I forgot the next part that I was supposed to talk about. So one of the things that when we got this data, wanted to create a display that showed where people were searching around the world. And so I worked with a couple of other engineers on finding government data that had cities to latitude and longitude information so that we could actually plot them on the point. And I learned that there are 2 different ways that Japanese gets put in the Roman alphabet, and our data set was in one and the government data set was in another, so I had to convert between those 2. But there was a lot of little conversions like that, and the end result was this display. This is when the Japanese office of Google opened. They put all these displays up. The one with the map of the world actually had a live display of when people were searching, and down below were some of the queries and where they were coming from, sort of scrolling by. And we eventually also turned it into a 3D display. This one, I believe that the colors indicate which data center it was being served from. It was a much more interesting display when I had the languages that people were searching in, because then you actually got to see the countries in Europe in various different colors. But I didn't have a slide of that one, unfortunately. And this picture appeared in the New York Times on Thanksgiving of 2002. Which made my parents really happy because I was home visiting and I was able to show them my picture in the paper. I had this bar set up outside my cubicle. People likened it to a drive-through window, and so people would bring little toys from like Happy Meals and leave them there. So I had a collection of toys there. People also compared it to a bar, so at one point I brought in some martini glasses and filled them with the colors of the Google logo. People asked if they could have a drink, and I was like, yeah, you just don't want to have water that's been sitting here for a week. The plasma display there was showing the globe, and you could control it with the keyboard, so you could speed up the rotation if you wanted to see different parts of the world and things like that. And the colors were indication of the language or which data center it was, which the production people really liked, but nobody else could understand. Yeah, so another thing that we did with this geographic data was we could plot it over time and see where the queries were coming from. This is a graph of web traffic in the United States to Google. And you can see during the middle of the day, there's a peak. There's like a cliff later at night, so people still use the internet while they're at home, but not quite as much. And then it goes down overnight. This is kind of what you would expect the traffic to look like. It goes pretty close to zero at around 3 o'clock in the morning. It's peaking in the afternoon. And different countries have different characteristics in terms of the way they look. And it's interesting to try and tell what the story is based on those. Mexico goes even further down overnight, so nobody's really online at night there. And later at night, it's higher than during the workday. So maybe people aren't using it so much at work, they're only using it at home, which is an interesting sort of, and of course this is 15-year-old data, so I wouldn't take these conclusions home and believe that they're still true, because the world has been changing. Germany looks a little bit more like the United States does in there. One of the reasons it's probably a little spikier there is that we had less traffic to Germany, so this is less data and it doesn't smooth itself over. France is interesting. Apparently the French actually care about lunchtime. Japan, it's pretty consistently high at nighttime, so there's much less of a drop-off when people go home. At the time, Japan was much more wired and a lot more mobile devices, so that probably explains that. There was one of Spain that I had in there. I guess I forgot to put that one in. Spain, the dip is, it looks the same as France, except it's an hour later in the day, so siesta. And that was kind of an interesting thing. Another thing that looking at these graphs was useful for was when Google got attacked with denial of service attacks, we could graph it out and look at how big the dip was that was caused by the attack. And the area under the curve there is the number of queries. So multiplying that by the expected advertising revenue gave us an estimate of how much revenue we lost during the attack. And if that number was more than $100,000, the FBI was interested. And so that was one of the techniques that I used and is actually relevant to the next part. So after I left Google, I went into politics. I have a picture here of the Supreme Court in honor of their hearing the case for marriage equality just last week. But the campaigns that I worked on were generally the marriage equality cases around the country. The first one was running the online operations for the No on Prop 8 campaign. And at one point, we actually got attacked by somebody who wanted to bring our website down. And this exact same technique that I was just describing for Google came in handy to get the Secret Service involved in investigating the attacks that we had. But this also comes back to a different part of telling stories. In political campaigns, it's very much important to actually tell a story. And one of the things that we learned in the marriage equality fight was that it wasn't about telling people broadly that equality is an important thing, even though I believe that that is true. What it is telling stories about the fact that we actually want to get married and we want to have lives and we love people, and it's the same as any other relationship there. And this was more sort of theoretical at the time for me, although since then I did meet my husband, who's sitting in the audience there. We got married last summer. And so it became that much more real for me. And when June comes around and the Supreme Court decision comes out, I think it's going to be a really emotional day for me. But the other story that I am completely drawing blank on what I was going to say next.
Lesbians in Miami?
No, that was the next part after. But I guess I'll get to that point now. So it's still not entirely clear how I got involved in theater from the political realm here. And I'll just switch to the Broadway slide now. Through that work, I was having a lot of meetings with other activists. And I don't remember what I was talking to Paul about this one time. But at the end of it, I asked him what kinds of projects he was working on. And The Normal Heart came up. So to backtrack a little bit and talk about the lesbians in Miami, I was at a conference where I was talking to some wealthy donors to LGBT political causes about the fact that nobody my age knows what happened in the 80s when HIV started hitting New York. And I think that that is shameful, and it's a story that needs to be told. So the next month when I was talking to this producer, and he was involved in The Normal Heart, I said to him, that sounds like a project that I can put my name on. And he said, oh, so you want to be a producer? And I think that my answer to him was, you're crazy. But I signed the contract 2 weeks later, so I was raising money for the show and getting involved in how to market it and all of the things that producers do on these things. And it was such an amazing night of theater, and it was amazing to see the audience reactions walking out. So many people were speechless. The ending of the production was particularly emotional because they started projecting the names of the people who had died in the early days of the epidemic. And as the projection went on, it spilled out into the audience because so many people were affected. And so people were just emotionally hit hard by this. And we ended up winning the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Play. And I decided that that was a story that was worth telling, and there are other stories out there that are worth telling, and I wanted to keep doing that. And so I've kept doing that, and that's what I'm up to these days. And that's how I became a producer.